I don't know if I would call this a world religion, but a philosophy that almost got me was Gandhi's writings. And then Gandhi wrote this one time. He said something along the lines of, I really like Jesus. It's just a shame that his church looks nothing like him. And I was like, hey, Gandhi likes Jesus. I can like Jesus too.
I find it really fascinating. And what my takeaway is, I sort of just I absorbed it and just accepted it. You were thoughtful. I think it's interesting. It says a lot about you in good ways. All I did was go, well, sure. But you were thinking, you were analyzing it and seeing it. I find that really admirable. All right, welcome to another Discovering God podcast. Glad you're back with us. I'm Rip Wahlberg.
And I'm Jeff McLean.
Good to have you, Jeff.
Yeah, it's
always good to be with you.
Another episode.
That's right. So, Jeff, what we're going to do this time is we're going to basically just help people get to know you more. It's because it's our podcast and want to give people a chance to know you, also where to find you, but also like where have you come from faith-wise and so forth. So first of all, again, how do people find you? Where do they find you online?
Yeah. Well, if you are interested in finding me online, the best place is probably just to look up jeffmclain.com, jeffmclain.com, and you can find my blog and other things I'm involved in right there. That's kind of like the main landing spot, and it'll link out from there.
Okay. And then, so first of all, tell me about your, come to Jesus moment. You grow up in the church, not grow up in the church. What's your salvation journey story?
Well, I did grow up in the church, but I wouldn't equate that necessarily to my salvation story. And so, to quote Sound of Music, let's start at the beginning, the very, very beginning. And, I grew up here in the Lancaster County area. I grew up to a mom and dad who were both practicing followers of Jesus. They attended church regularly. My dad was a deacon. My mom was involved in everything in the church. In fact, I remember do you remember a time in a church when people would sing back with backtracks on cassette? I just started thinking about this the other day. There would be like special music during the offertory in church.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like a recording, and one side had the vocals and the other side. And I can remember sometimes she's going to listen to this and get mad that I talked about this, but I can remember a time of her doing that a few times.
I can remember going to the Christian bookstore and finding those tapes.
In a clearance bin. It was always like a big wood barrel here, and they were always on discount.
That's a long time ago.
So anyway, grew up attending church. My maternal side has been followers of Jesus clear back to the 16th century.
Wow.
I can tell you where we broke off the Catholic Church and joined the Anabaptist people. In fact, my family on the maternal side started a church movement called the Brethren in Christ. And so my maternal side has been following Jesus a long time. I mean, like 3 of my uncles went to Bible school.
Yeah.
Many people had pastored. My grandfather was a church planner. Then there's my paternal side, my dad's side.
Mm-hmm.
And atheist probably as far back as the other side was follower of Jesus.
Okay.
And so my dad was a first generation believer.
Okay.
And what's interesting about that is Eddie Gibbs at Fuller Seminary says that kids of a first generation believer are uniquely positioned to understand the world, but also the difference Jesus makes. And by the 3rd generation, it's almost like in this entitlement, you've lost sight of what it means to live between the two worlds. And so I share that only to say, in some ways, I was both 2nd generation follower of Jesus and 3rd, because one side had been followers of Jesus and that's all they knew. They breathed and talked about it. And then the other side I mean, the only time I ever heard Jesus' name on that side was a swear word,
Yeah.
and they were creative swearers. I mean, they knew some good words.
Creative ways to say
Yeah,
Jesus' name.
and yeah,
Yes.
and he has a middle name, but we'll talk about that another time. But in all reality, I grew up between those two worlds, and very early on, I really enjoyed the church. We attended a church of like 300, 400 people. That was a beautiful community.
Huh.
And I remember it being a great melting pot. Years later, I learned there was a vineyard influence in there, which I would have not known. There were Mennonites in it. It was this melting pot of many different people.
Okay.
And unfortunately, it eventually, as I was in my teens, experienced some disillusionment. It split up. But that was a shaping moment for me because that's the community I knew. And they also walked with my family. My dad had stage 4 cancer when I was small, when I was 4 and 5, 87 to 88, I think it was. And so I was in kindergarten. Very, very, important part of my life that shaped a lot of who I am because I watched the church care for us. I watched my dad was a police officer. I watched local police departments come out and support him. But I also had some deep questions for God early on. Like, really? Why this? Why does he allow this? And so asked some of those questions early on. By the time the church was falling apart, that created some deep disillusionment in me. My parents ended up going into a church that was more kind of even more conservative or legalistic or fundamental. And I think there was a protective aspect in that, like, oh, it'll never experience the problems the other one has because there's more control in the system. And that was my take as a young man, not probably their take.
Right.
But early on, I felt like an outsider. I felt like I wasn't welcome there, felt often judged by people there. And so early on, I began to question my faith, the reality of church. And it was at that point where I started identifying myself as a spiritual pilgrim. And
at about what age?
I was probably about 15 at that point.
Okay.
And so in that era, I don't think I was ready to throw out Jesus. In fact, I remember trying to understand a position of our church, and they said, well, you've never read books like Martin Luther's Bondage of the Will. And so till you read a book like that, you don't know what you're talking about. So at 16, I went out and bought Martin Luther's Bondage of the Will.
I was to say, like, I know you, and you probably went out and read it. You probably read it.
I read it in a few weeks and wrote a report on it.
Right.
Yeah, and which they never took the time to read. And
right.
Thankfully, I don't have a copy of it because it was probably embarrassing. Really boring read. Don't highly recommend that book. But so I began to deep think things. In fact, I've always been a person that loves finding bargain books, and so I started reading sociology books, psychology, like textbooks from colleges and high schools that I would pick up at Goodwill, and I just started to read those. And I grew more and more disillusioned with our local expression of the church, and eventually walked away from it and found other things to do. I felt like for a while that God was found more in nature, and so when everyone was going to church, I would come to a Sunday school. Our church had a Sunday school for people that I don't really know what this Sunday school was meant for, but it was full of mostly men in their 40s and 50s that were single or divorced. And there was some interesting characters in this Sunday school. I mean, I would look at them and I'm like, no wonder people doesn't come to church. Like there was this guy, all he did was talk about roller coasters. And he would travel all around and go see roller coasters. And that, to me, just struck me as really weird. But I would attend Sunday school with these guys because they were wrestling through some teachings of R.C. Sproul. They were going through Hebrews chapter by chapter. And then I would leave, and my friends and I would go down to the Chesapeake Bay. We'd rent a boat, which, looking back, 16-year-old kid could rent a boat for $20 and put in your driver's license down. And they would let us drive out into the shipping lanes of the bay. I mean, it was.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, looking back,
that's pretty far out there.
It was
into the shipping lanes.
Yeah, I don't know if we were supposed to go that far, but we did go that far.
Yeah,
and so we would just have spiritual conversations. What do we believe about this? And eventually, that led to me not wanting a lot to do with the church overall.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
So, what was it though that like? Was there something, and I don't want to get personal, but just
I'm an open book.
That was there a point or an event that kind of you feel drove you away from the church, or was it a drift?
Well, I think early on it was the drift. When you see a community that feels like family split apart, just like a family that experiences divorce or anything, like there's that reality of the safety net of it is gone. You see the wizard behind the curtain a little bit, and I think though what made it worse is as we settled into that new church after trying several churches and seeing again more wizards behind the curtains, I instantly realized how cliquish the church can be,
Mm.
how judgmental it was. I mean, there were statements like my friends and I would joke in youth group with each other, call each other names, and we get kicked out of youth group for that. But the youth pastor talked down to us and called us names all the time.
So you saw a hypocrisy.
For sure.
Yeah.
And there were things like, as we tried to understand theological points the church was making, the pastor would say things like, well, you're just going to have to trust me. I'm smarter than you. So you were put down.
Mm-hmm.
There was this reality that just, it didn't seem like the place it was supposed to be.
So even genuine questions.
Oh, yeah.
Were sort of like
one of the big ones
dismissed.
For me was the elect. They had a lot of understandings on the elect.
Yeah.
And I was trying to understand it, scripturally. I was a big reader and had read opposing viewpoints. And I remember trying to meet with the pastor, try to understand it. And basically his final statements to me was, I was probably not part of the elect, otherwise I wouldn't question it. And so, when somebody tells you that you have a problem with authority, eventually, if they tell you it enough, you believe it.
Yeah.
And so I kind of said, "Oh yeah, I don't like it." And I was a huge fan of the punk rock music scene, which pushed back on everyone and everything. And so I think I lived into what people were saying, and decided just to leave. At 18, I moved out of my house and began to live. Looking back, sorry, mom and dad, but there was a crazy stuff in there. We had a roommate that used a lot of drugs. He was mentally unstable. There were people that came and went. In some ways, it was kind of a pilgrimage for all the people in that house. And then I ended up moving into another apartment where I wanted to create a commune of sorts. I wanted it to be a place of spiritual search. I was very taken by the 60s hippie movements and their search for truth. And so I went out and bought every religious book I could find in that second apartment. And I had the Quran, I had the Book of Mormon, and I had writings of the Buddhas, New Age ideas, and I went through it. And looking back, I would do silly things. There was a point in my life where I decided, well, maybe the reason I can't hear God or Allah is that I'm inside a house and the house is inhibiting me in some way. So I drug my couch out onto the porch and I read the Quran out there.
Because it's not enough to just be outside.
Right.
You clearly have to have the couch.
Right. And never mind that I was like drinking a 6-pack of Corona while I was doing it. I mean, or something like, but I was on a quest to find what was truth. And at the end of the day, I came to realize that Jesus was the only thing that made sense.
So let's hang on.
But I didn't go back to the church.
Yeah. So that's kind of it. It still brings me to the question I was going to ask is, were you disinterested in faith or were you disinterested in the institution?
Yeah. I was.
Because this is a question that I'm asking young people as much as I can these days.
Early on, I had a quest, I would say, just to find truth. If there was no God, I needed to know. I didn't want to have false hopes. But I also deeply wanted there to be a God and more to life than this. And so I was driven to find faith.
So yours was a search for meaning.
A search for meaning, truth, something I could trust for myself, not on anyone else's teaching.
Okay. And
I had to experience it. That I will tell you, I know back then I remember thinking, whatever is true, I need to experience it to know it's true. I can't just read it. I need to experience it.
So what then eventually was the experience, and why Jesus?
Yeah. There was many experiences. I mean, I would even spend a week or so sleeping on the streets in Philadelphia. I would take time off work and just sleep on the streets. And I learned to play harmonica on the streets of Rittenhouse Square with a homeless guy named Miguel. And I just spent time experiencing whatever I could. I hitchhiked across the country with bands. I did concert promotions. I was looking to experience everything.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, though, that I never, what's interesting is I never gave into drugs. I never really pursued a lot of I mean, we party, but not to that level, because I figured that would interrupt my search for truth in some way, that it would crowd or cloud my brain. And so, the Book of Mormon didn't make sense to me. So I was kind of like, okay, that's not it. The Quran felt really beautiful to me. I mean, there's still aspects of it that I go, man, that's a beautiful piece of literature. But there was something about still reading the Bible that felt warm to me, or like truth. And when I would read it, though, I would tell myself, but this is probably conditioning. I want it to be true, or I grew up with it. So there's this conditioning aspect to it. And so I would do things, argue with people. We would have these gatherings in our house of people from all walks of life, and I would say, "Tell me how this is conditioning," and I would try to prove myself wrong. But as much as I did that, there were little things that made me still trust in Jesus, other than the truth as to I just was really attracted to his lifestyle. I mean, there was something about the way he lived and the way he gave meaning to people that was unmatched in any other world religion.
It's interesting to me about that is we always hear about fully God, fully man, and so forth. But I never grew up paying much attention to the humanity of Jesus until I was older.
Yeah.
You're talking about, you saw the Bible through the lens of Jesus' humanity.
For sure.
And I grew up always being taught and thinking through the lens of Jesus' divinity.
For sure. I would have grown up that way too.
I know you would have grown up there.
His death and his birth mattered, but his life didn't matter so much.
Right. But I find it really fascinating. And what my takeaway is, I sort of just I absorbed it and just accepted it. You were thoughtful. I think it's interesting. It says a lot about you in good ways. All I did was go, well, sure. But you were thinking, you were analyzing it and seeing it. I find that really admirable.
I would say that one of the, I don't know if I would call this a world religion, but a philosophy that almost got me was Gandhi's writings. And then Gandhi wrote this one time. He said something along the lines of, I really like Jesus. It's just a shame that his church looks nothing like him. And I was like, hey, Gandhi likes Jesus. I can like Jesus too. And, there were people in my life that showed up. Ironically, though I wasn't sure where I was at with Jesus as a church, I worked for a Christian organization. And so there were Christians around, which was good and bad. For some of it, it was like, I never want to be part of these people. They are so full of hypocrisy. They're so, contradicting themselves. And in addition to that, there were other people that were on a journey too, that they were able to introduce things to me that I hadn't thought about before. One of those, a friend of mine named Josh, and him and I would sit in a diner, and we read the Ragamuffin Gospel by Brennan Manning. Mm-hmm. And coming out of that, I was like, all right. And I don't know why, but Jesus used that book. The Holy Spirit used that book to where I was like, I like Jesus. I think he's actually divine. Otherwise, his story doesn't make sense. And I had read C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity 4 or 5 times at that point,
Wow.
You can still, I have a copy of it in my office, and there's like 5 different highlightings. There's pens and pencils. I'm crossing stuff out I don't agree with. Like there's these notes. Same with the Ragamuffin Gospel. But I eventually landed like, okay, I like Jesus. And he was faithful to show up. I mean, I remember one time this lady calling me out of the blue. And she was someone I had never met. I had met her son who played in a band. And she said, I was just praying. She called me like 5 in the morning. She lived in Colorado, and she said, God put me on you on my mind. And I don't even remember what it was, but she was like, this is something you're dealing with right now. And there was no way she would have known that, because I would have, whatever it was, I remember thinking I would never admit this to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow she found my blog, which blogs weren't even a thing yet. We talked about this a little before the show, but she found it, found my phone number, and called me out of state and read my mail.
Damn.
And I was like, all right. And so there were little encounters like that all the time. I would have dreams that would come true. Someone would give me a book that opened a view. Someone gave me a prophetic word that would kind of point me back to Jesus. And I'd be like, oh yeah, there's some stuff in the Bible about this. So this seems true. But the one thing I knew, like Gandhi, I didn't want anything to do with the Christians. I remember trying churches. I was like, this Bible says you need community. And so I would go. I remember trying this one church one time, and there was only 5 people in the congregation. And one guy next to me was on a breathing machine. I mean, he couldn't help this, but he sounded like Darth Vader. He was like, and like I couldn't even hear the sermon because his breathing machine was so loud. And the pastor comes up to me afterwards. Now, remember, I'm not even sure 100% where I'm at yet. And he's like, wow, you're like the first person under 50 we've had in years. Have you ever thought about being a youth pastor? Because we really need one. I'm like, look, I'm not even sure I believe all of your book yet. So I never went back. There was another time I went to a small Baptist church. Everyone had cowboy hats on. I think they talked more about politics than the Bible. I was like, okay, yep. These people do not understand Jesus. So I stayed out of it. The thing that took me into the church. Yeah. And I'm going to tell the story, but realize that over the years, it may have grown in my brain or my mind. But I had just moved into a small apartment, a 1-bedroom efficiency, and I was beginning to tour with bands. I was getting some notice as a concert promoter and an activist. I was highly involved in activism in DC and stuff like that. And I needed a small apartment just to come home to. So I didn't have internet, and this is in the days of dial-up and DSL. Comcast and high speed was not a thing yet as much. And so I'm laying in bed, and I have this dream in which I'm in the air and I'm looking down. Again, perhaps this has grown in my ears, so I don't want to say "so saith God," but I remember seeing people hanging on vineyards and vines and orchard trees, and I heard a voice kind of just say, well, this is the vineyard. This is my people for you. And I woke up so shaken by that dream. By that point, I started to pay attention to dreams that were vivid, high color, very memorable. And I encountered it as part of the experience that I needed. And so I root through my trash to find, it was either an AOL CD or a Juno CD. That was free dial-up internet. Do you remember those?
Yeah, I remember that.
And so, I'm installing it on my computer. I'm waiting for it to connect. And I start to use search.com or Dogpile because Google's not even a thing really yet. And I search, Vineyard Church, which I had no idea what that was, other than I had a dream about it. And found that there was this small church that had just started. And they were just getting ready to have Sunday morning services. And so I think I went, not that Sunday, because had to build up some momentum, but the next Sunday I went in and I made this battle plan of how I was going to escape this place. And I remember walking in, and they met in the Good Seal building, the Schreiber Center. Yeah. You were there later on. And as soon as the double doors opened, I was like, already planning my escape plan. And I said to God, if you're real, you know what I need out of this. And I started to see people I knew from the job I had. And I never knew some of them were actually followers of Jesus, but no, I'm just teasing.
I know where you're talking about. It's like, you didn't think they were followers of Jesus?
I just say that jokingly, but they never told me about the vineyard. You know what I mean? Like, so here I am thinking, man, these guys were really undercover. Like, I would have never known they were part of something like this, because I thought they were part of the other kind of churches. And so I'm saying hi to them. And then Jerry's the pastor, and he walks up to me, and he kind of, at that time, was, a lot shorter than me. Still is a lot shorter than me, but he was more plump. I remember thinking, this guy looks like a teddy bear. Like, I picture him coming up to me, and all of a sudden he just kind of gives me a side hug and says, "Welcome." And when he did that, because I had found the church as avoidant for so many years, I felt this supernatural disarming.
Huh.
And it was when that I knew God had answered, you know what I need out of this. I mean, when he put his arm around me and then he said, "Hey, do you want to get coffee sometime?" After years of trying to have conversations about stuff with a pastor who didn't want to have conversations with me,
Right.
it was like God reversed all of that. And I instantly knew I had found my home. Now, I didn't settle in 100%, nor was I ready to believe. I mean, I think the first time Jerry invited me to like do announcements, I flicked him off because I wasn't ready to fully be invested yet. But I knew at that point there was something different about that church, about Jerry, about the people in that church, and what I now know as the Vineyard Movement.
And he made space for you without saying you have to believe like we believe to be in.
Yeah.
And yet he made space for you while you were on your journey.
And I think that was, if you're looking at how to walk with somebody, Jerry, I mean, I feel like there's sometimes I was meeting with him twice a week. I was complaining about stuff in life one time, processing it with him, my fears that I would turn into this kind of person. And I was also processing God and the church. And so there was these two kind of meetings that he would have with me where we were working on inner stuff, but I also think he invested in me as a leader. And he also called leadership gifts out in me. I mean, that when I first got invited to the leadership team, to give you an example of how good he was at giving space. A few years ago, actually, Jerry visited me at a church I pastored. He said, "Do you still tell that story?" I said, "Yeah, do you want me to stop?" He said, "No, you can keep telling it." So I'm going to tell it. Jerry invited me to the leadership team. You're on leadership team at this point.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, and I was already dating a girl. I was convinced of God at this point in church, but I still didn't like Christians. And I wasn't fully sanctified, not that I am yet, but there was still a lot of brokenness. And so I was like, there's no way I'm sitting through a 3-hour business meeting like with Christians. And so I brought a 6-pack of beer. And Jerry had a conversation with me, but in my brokenness, all I heard was, it's not fair that no one else had a 6-pack of beer. So the next week, I brought the 6-pack for myself and then a 6-pack for all you guys to share. And yeah, Jerry had a conversation about it with me, but he gave me space to be me. He allowed me to belong before I needed to learn how to behave or believe in a certain way.
Right. That's interesting. It's a good
Yeah.
skill. So what would you say in closing? What would you say to the person that is walking your shoes, next generation kind of thing? Walking that I'm disillusioned. It's almost the deconstruction conversation.
It is.
But not quite. So what would you say to the person that you see sort of mirroring you, but a couple generations?
My mission statement has
younger?
Become to help people think differently about Jesus, life, and everything in between. And as I walk with people in light of that, trying to help them on a journey to faith, what I see far too often, whether it's deconstruction or a search for truth, people give up too soon. And what I mean by that is, they have another bad experience and they stop looking. Or they run into another pastor that is falling from the pulpit because of a mistake he's made or an abuse that he's made. And they just give up their search. And I would say for people that are on a journey, truth has to be the driving force for you. You need to not just get frustrated and give up, you can't know. Truth has to guide you. And I believe that any true pursuit of truth will lead you to Jesus. And I know that's a big statement and we don't have time to unpack it, but I do believe that anyone who's authentically looking for truth will end up with Jesus. Secondly, don't worry about figuring it all out. Embrace the mystery a little bit. I think that was one of the hardest things for me is every time I found a contradiction or what seemed like a contradiction in a person's life or even in the scriptures, I was ready to throw it out. And the third thing I would say, so keep searching for truth, embrace the mystery, pay attention to the signs along the way. As I look back on my story, I realized that how that lady called me out of the blue was one of many stories. I was in New Jersey one time for a friend's wedding, and my friend Matt and I were waiting for the couple to arrive. We didn't know the pastor that was going to marry them. He was just some random guy they found in the Yellow Pages. And he invites us into his house. We'd been on the beach all day. We're smelly. We've been surfing and bodyboarding. And he goes, "Hey, why don't you come in and have some lemonade and cookies?" And he gave us a prophetic word. I didn't even know what prophetic words were, because that's not the kind of church I grew up in. He said something like, you don't see it now, but God's going to introduce himself to you. And I remember this statement. He said, and he's going to put you on stages. He's going to give you an audience. At the time, I was like, well, yeah, it's because I'm trying to be a rock star. Like, I'm playing in punk bands and I'm touring with punk bands. Yeah, God wants me to be this divine force behind everything. That's all he was. He wants me to be famous. And years later, I was like, oh, I realize now. But so pay attention to the signs. God is searching for you as much as you're searching for him. And there's little signs along the way that prove that all the time. Even going into a small church that I couldn't stand, it said, "Hey, you want to be a youth pastor?" I now think they probably saw something in me. You know what I mean? So there's a reality that pay attention to the signs on your journey.
Yeah. That's a good word. I like that. Three nice conclusions and your takeaways, but exhortations and challenges to someone else that's sort of in a similar spot in life. So
let me say one more challenge, actually. Okay. And this is my challenge to everyone that's not experienced a spiritual sojourn, is what I call my journey, a spiritual sojourn, a pilgrimage. Don't ever feel like you've arrived, though. I think we do an injustice to what it means to be a follower of Jesus when we feel like we've arrived or figured it out. I realized a few years ago, I was driving to Maine and I had thrown out all my punk rock CDs. I no longer called myself a spiritual pilgrim. And I really felt like I heard God say to me on the drive, like, I was never the one that told you to stop that. And it wasn't that I'll run back to that lifestyle. It was, I lost something in my heart of searching for truth. I had settled and was not pushing back on things anymore. And so I would say, never arrive. I think spiritual pilgrimage should be what the life of a follower of Jesus looks like, in search of truth and answer.
Yeah, that's a good word. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you for letting me tell my story.
Absolutely. So, folks, thanks for joining us. Always give us a like and subscribe, and help us get the word out, share it out. And hopefully just through watching the podcast and you studying the Bible or going into the Bible, you'll come face to face with God by coming face to face with his word.